Hello everybody and welcome to Richard and Mike Do Faith.
Hello, welcome.
Hello, I'm mic'd up.
Yes, Dave!
Featuring special guest, producer Dave.
Special guest that's always been here.
Yeah.
Yeah, when we were planning today's session, we all got together as normal and Dave had some particularly good insights. So we were like, yeah, you have to be on this one.
And now we're going to see if I can actually remember anything I said.
Dave always has good insights while we're planning as well, so it's good to
Yeah.
get that happening. Yeah. So we do actually still have food, even though we're Rich and Mike Do Faith now. So what are we having today, Rich?
So today we have some Turkish baklava. Now I don't know about the pronunciation, so I've heard it called baklava and baklava. Any ideas, guys?
I've called it baklava and now I call it
I
baklava.
think baklava is I always get in my head an association with balaclava, even though it's clearly nothing to do with, I suppose vaguely it goes near your face, but that's...
There's a lot of choice here, as you'll see from the photos, guys.
I think we've got 4 different types.
And you bought a kilogram of stuff as well.
A kilogram.
This is rich stuff.
So you've got one of
I've
the
got
end ones.
one that looks a bit like a sausage roll.
Okay, so I'll go for this one, which looks like, how would you describe it? Oh my gosh, it's so thick.
Really, it's like glued together with honey.
It is. It's not too bad, actually. I thought it was going to be overpowering.
It's really nice, isn't it?
So this is like cake that's been left in honey for a good few days.
For those familiar with Lord of the Rings, my theory is that baklava is like the kind of dessert equivalent of Latmus bread, the sort of thing that they bring up the mountain that you only need to have a
It's
little
like a
nibble
little
of.
morsel and then that satisfies you.
One mouthful will fill a man for 2
Exactly,
days or
yeah.
something.
Could very easily have a sleep after even just a little bit of that. So today's theme that we're going to be talking about is disappointment. So a cheery one for today, but I think a very important one. Messing about aside. I suppose disappointment is something that everyone has experienced at some point in their life. If you're not experiencing it at the moment, then you certainly will have done, to one degree or another. So I think it's a good thing to kind of chat about today. So it's one of those ones that, it's an interesting one. I think one of the misconceptions that perhaps can be batted around occasionally in faith-based life and Christian life is that when you become a Christian, you start following Jesus and no more sadness, no more tears, everything's going to go well for you after this point. He's going to solve all your problems. And yeah, I just don't think that's true. I think disappointment and sadness and stuff is inevitable. That just continues.
Yeah.
But I think there's a different way of seeing that and there's a different way of interacting with that, which is really quite stark when you give your life to Jesus and when you are following him through that. I think one of the things is that he is absolutely with you in that disappointment, and I think that for me is the main difference of living through disappointment following Jesus and not. Did you guys have any thoughts on disappointment?
Yeah.
Or
I think one of the things I would reflect is it might not be that there's kind of an expectation that things will always go well for you when you sort of become a Christian, but there might be a sense, and I think sometimes through some church cultures, whether sort of directly or indirectly, there can be this kind of feeling where you will experience things go wrong, but it shouldn't matter to you. And if you're close to God, then the sting of it shouldn't matter that much because actually, you're believing in something bigger. And I think one of the things we'd want to acknowledge early on is you do feel it.
yeah,
And I think it part of what we want to talk about today a little bit is there's a point, I think, like you said, Mike, about kind of knowing God's with you with it. but that's often processing still quite difficult emotions that can kind of come with some of those things, from anything from quite a minor setback to kind of something that is, you know, a major life-changing event as a result of something going wrong. And I think, yeah, it's a real spectrum of things. And, you know, I think what I'd want to say early on, at least, is, you know, if you're feeling let down and sad about stuff, that isn't reflective of you having a pants relationship with God. It's just a natural part of, you know, human existence. So, yeah.
So, Dave, like, I think that's really interesting.
Yeah.
I think I completely agree with what you're saying. So, Jesus basically says it's going to be tough, and you can expect it to be tough. But you were talking about the whole idea of it's really how do we deal with that that disappointment? How do we process it? And I'm not very good at processing my emotions, and I think up until more recently, it was a case of the kind of keep calm and carry on, just keep pushing through kind of thing. And I've realised that's not really the best thing for life. But I think there's a question of, well, how do we then process disappointment? What would you say? Just to put you on the spot there.
I think, and I think we're going to kind of come through this at different points through the podcast today. I think the first thing I would say is not always with great grace and aplomb. I think sometimes there's a lot of difficulty, and I think there can often be one of the things that you sometimes talk about a bit in social work, and I think we talk about this particularly in kind of like you know, addiction theory, but there's kind of this idea of the virtuous spiral, and it can often feel, when you've sort of started in a difficult place, you've kind of made a journey, and then you sort of find yourself in the same difficult place again, and you think you've not really travelled. But actually, what you're not seeing so much with that is that if you look at it in 2D, I'm doing this in the air as if you can see it on the podcast, it's not very helpful. But if you look at it in 2D, it's like a circle. If you go 3D, it's like a spiral that kind of goes up, if that makes sense. And every time you deal with those things, there's kind of a little bit of progress. I think one of the things we're going to talk about is a bit about what the Bible says, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But also, I think we've talked, you know, we were talking when we were prepping about this a lot about emotional honesty, being real with God, and kind of the role of other people in our lives with that, and kind of helping you not just kind of get to the same point where you were with something. And I think sometimes there can be, you know, a really miraculous thing from God that does, you know, help you feel better about a situation or deal with some of those difficult emotions or let you go of stuff. Sometimes there is kind of a bit more of a gradual process that goes with some of these things, in my experience, and it's often really synonymous with grief as well. And sometimes, again, depending on what's happened, it can be actual grief, you know. And I think there is that whole thing that I think most people would acknowledge about grief. There's, you know, there's kind of steps you go through, but, you know, people talk about the sort of ball in the box analogy with a button at the bottom, and, you know, it sort of when you're first disappointed, when you first experience that grief, it's kind of this massive ball is bouncing around this box, hitting the button all the time because it's a huge ball, but over time it kind of gets smaller. And part of that, I think, is stuff that we'll kind of talk about a little bit as we kind of go through. That's my initial thoughts. Don't know, what do you think, guys? Have you got any other thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I like that analogy. This is, they kind of work quite well together, don't they, those two models? I suppose that's when you can kind of apply that maybe to particular life events that have happened that have disappointed you or you're grieving. And as time goes on, it becomes less significant as things move forward. How would you guys look at that from a perspective of a follower of Jesus? Do you think? What would you say about that, Rich?
Let me give you a bit of a story, so a bit of a situation that I've been going through. So about a year ago, I really felt God talk to me about something, about a project that he wanted me to work on. Well, not just me, as a family, me and my wife predominantly, but it involved the kids as well. And we've spent the best part of the last year working towards that. And like it was a real step of faith, because it's an area that we've got very little experience in, but we felt God was saying move into this. And I remember talking with a friend who works in that area, and they said, look, the reality is, if I was going to be working with you in this, I would just say no. I respected and really honoured that decision, but they did also say, but if you have a sense of faith, go for it. And we went for it, and there have been many challenges, and God's really developed us in it. But the big thing is, like, it all kind of came to a standstill a while ago, but it wasn't for the right reason. So, like, the reason that person said that they wouldn't work with us, I expected issues there, but they weren't the reasons. And like, it was just ridiculous reasons this whole thing came to a standstill. And then along the way, there had been like miraculous moments, miraculous provision, really, I would say, to the point that we tell people the stories and they're just like, wow, that's amazing. And like, when you see God move like that, you can't help but think, this is God's plan.
Yeah.
This is God's plan. But then when it all comes to a halt for ridiculous reasons, and it's kind of out of your control, you think, well, God, what's this about? What are you doing? And then, like, I'd made decisions, like financial decisions based on this, like potentially, well, actually, I'm going to be working 4 days a week next year rather than 5. So there's an actual financial investment, and I'm just like, I'm actually a bit disappointed, because you spend the best part of a year thinking about something, get excited about it, you feel God's behind you, and then it's a bit of a, so that's something we've been going through as a couple, as a family. And then I think it was before we started to discuss this episode, we went away on some kind of leadership thing that we're doing, and God kind of he spoke to us on the situation, like there's a new kind of direction, potentially a new lease of life. But I think that all started in a place of me being real with God, being honest with God. And I know we've spoken about this in other podcasts before, about being real with God. But when we were planning this, I think you guys really hit it on the head. You described it as lamenting, and you referred to the book of Lamentations. And in that book, they are just crying out to God, and they're just saying how bad it is. And I think that was one thing that I managed to do. And like, when you're talking about processing emotions, Dave, I think that whole idea of just going to God and saying, God, what on earth is going on? I don't understand. I think that was one of the turning points for me, because I was real with God and I was real with who I am. If you do that whole thing of just saying, this is good, this is fine. Yes, we have to honour God. We have to recognise that his ways are higher than ours. However, if you're not feeling it, if that's not who you are, he knows that. And if you don't say that stuff, if you don't express it to him however you would do that, you're not being real with him. And I think that was one of the turning points. And I think it wasn't that it just made me feel better. It didn't make me feel better. But I think I was able to enter into a new place with God and come to a new place where I could see what he was doing, or what he might be doing, and have a new sense of faith.
Can I ask you a little bit more about that, Rich, in terms of kind of how that happened? Like, was there something you particularly felt God say to you through that, or was it kind of like, was it more of a kind of internal release, would you say, in that kind of thing?
So obviously I've been a bit cryptic with what's actually going on, because we need to kind of see things through. But I would say what God did was he showed an alternative method, which we'd always said no to because it was just a bit riskier. But it was, and I think he also showed me how that was more in line with what we'd actually wanted. So my wife, she's a very blue sky thinker, and she has this big pipe dream, and for once it's one dream which I haven't said no to. I said, that sounds really good. I don't know how it works, but I'd love to see that happen. And what we are looking to do now, as opposed to what we were going to do, is closer to that dream than what the other thing was. And I think God's just kind of, he's given a new kind of leasing a new hope, and it's almost as though I'm starting to see how the miraculous provision before, actually, as miraculous as it was, I think it was potentially to prevent us from getting hurt with the stuff that's not worked out the way we wanted it to do and suffering from that, so that we could potentially do not what would just be good, but actually something that we will enjoy and we would like. And so where we are at the moment, and part of the reason I'm not really going into too many details, is that we feel that God has said something new to us, and it's quite exciting, but we're holding it before him. So we're just saying, God, if this is of you, we're going to just wait for you to do something, because it might be just a pipe dream which fades. It might not. And I think it's been good, because I think through that disappointment, we're able to see that he's maybe doing something different. We're able to see where we've been protected as well. And I think that honesty just brought us into a new place where we were able to relate to him in a different way about our disappointment. And now we're able to see slightly more of what's going on, and hopefully something different in the future.
Do you think, it sounds kind of like what you're saying, that is your journey is still happening right now, but almost you wouldn't have gone the route you're now going if it hadn't been for the failure, or not the failure, but the kind of dead ends perhaps you met earlier on, or the things not working out as you'd initially thought they would. Is that what you're saying? There's like a kind of preparation almost there, like you're kind of, he's changed your mind, or he's kind of taken you through yet. That's what you would have been prepared to accept at that point in time. But having gone through that process, and that kind of, you seeing that as kind of, well, that's not an option now, maybe. Now you can see the other option through a different lens.
I think you're right. And you know what? The other option was always there. It was been there since day one, but for lots of reasons, we just pushed it to one side. But we're even seeing the other option in a different way. And yeah, you're right. If we hadn't gone through this, we wouldn't have seen it in this way. And do you know what? It might still come to nothing. It might be nothing, but I'm more okay with that now than I was before. And I think through the disappointment, like you're saying, Dave, it's kind of like grief. You realise you can kind of live without things, and I'm more excited for what he's going to do now than I was before.
I think it's a really interesting one, because it's like, to use I guess kind of on the more extreme end of things, kind of like not to say that Richards isn't, like, I know it's been really difficult for those guys. But yes, about a year and a half ago now, my dad passed away. And I think it was an interesting one, because we were obviously, and it was brain tumour. For those of you who sort of haven't experienced that, it's about anywhere between 6 to 7 months of quite fast deteriorating, like sort of cognitive function and physical function. There was a lot of disappointment with that, about, why Dad wasn't getting better, and kind of what was going on there. I think one of the ones that was interesting, and again, sort of like, not to say that, it's all better and, everything's fine now. It's still something that's kind of like, I'm kicking about my head quite a lot. But like, I think there was one of the things that we kind of talk about with that was, it was 7 months, and probably for some members of my family, there was a point where I think even 1 or 2 days before he passed, there was an element where they had been able to get to a point of acceptance with what was going on, that I kind of feel like would have devastated them had that not happened. And I think the big disappointment for me was, I kind of wanted it to be, I think I'd kind of got to the point of accepting that things were happening, but I kind of just didn't want to see my dad in distress and pain. And actually, 7 months isn't that long in the wider scheme of how long some people suffer with these things, but to see that kind of drag on was I think, the big disappointment for me. But then I think, a little bit like Richard was saying, what I couldn't see was kind of possibly the end of that story, which for one of my relatives was really, really important in terms of kind of what that meant for them. And it's kind of, I think one of the other things with some of the disappointment stuff, and like what I meant to do before this podcast, which I didn't do because, you know, I'm rubbish at doing work before stuff. But there's a Pete Greig book called God on Mute. And I think there's a lot of different things he talks about there about unanswered prayer particularly. And one of the things that he talks about is that we often see ourselves as kind of like the main character in these stories, and actually it's not always about us and our experience. And there can kind of, you know, what can be our disappointment can actually be someone else's kind of success. And I guess part of what we'll talk about in the community side of things a bit later through this is like actually, you know, through that kind of experience together, there can sometimes be a better understanding of what God's plan might have been in something, which can help. You don't always get that though. I think, you know, it's probably important to say. But yeah, I think it's an interesting one. We should probably talk about some Bible stuff, I guess. We talked about Lamentations, didn't we?
We did.
I had a thought about the lamenting thing while you were talking about it, Rich, to go back to it. Because hearing you talk about it there was interesting because, I don't know, some people might say it maybe feels a little bit self-indulgent. If you read Lamentations in the Bible, it's not an easy read and it's not a fun read. It's not one you just kind of sit and chop your way through probably, but it literally is just Israel weeping and just mourning, just saying how awful everything is, how terrible Israel is now and how destitute it is for chapter upon chapter, quite poetically, but still pretty miserably. And so why? Why would you spend a whole book in the Bible, keep that in the Bible, and why is that important? And it kind of sounds like a bit of a turning point for you, allowing yourself to do that in your disappointing story, Rich. I don't know if you can relate as well, Dave, from your perspective and your thought that process you said, Richard, didn't make things better, but helped you with a new perspective, perhaps once you'd gone through that process, or helped you. It just kind of strikes me that that's an important process, even just weeping. You know, when you're grieving, it's an important thing to do. To have a bit of a cry, probably not the same for everyone, probably, but maybe it just helps us see, yeah, that is real. That's where this is at. And this is my experience. This is a sad, disappointing thing that has happened to me or somebody else or is happening, and I'm going to respond to that. And yeah, it doesn't change anything, but actually, I don't know if the right word is, it almost validates it, or it almost just helps you see, yeah, I'm sad about this, and that's my response to that sadness.
Yeah, I think we do need to do that, and I think, like what you were just saying about validating it made me think about how we support others, really. And it's really hard, like, to support people through disappointing times. And as a friend, you just want to make it better. And I remember when your dad was ill, Dave, we couldn't do anything to make that better. We didn't have any magic words, but actually just being a friend and just being with people is what people need sometimes. And I think
it's hugely important for us, I think.
Yeah. And I think that whole thing of validating, just being able to say, yeah, this sucks. And being with someone, I think we said when we were prepping about the story of Job, didn't his friends just go and sit with him?
Well, this is the thing. When we were prepping, what we were saying was, rather than his friends sitting with him, they all were trying to say, you know,
that was it.
Effectively, everything happens for a reason, and trying to probe what the reason was. And the fact is, in the story of Job, there wasn't a reason that they could understand. You know, it was something else, which is kind of what God comes in and says at the end. You know, and I think that whole thing of being able to just sit with people, and sometimes there can be sort of things that you can process, but actually that, I think, acknowledgement of justice is really difficult. I think, like we were saying, was, you know, that can be a much more helpful starting point than trying to explain why something's happened. Because you might be wrong for a start. But also, I think, it's not always helpful. That's not always what you need when you're kind of in that place, I think.
And it can be easy to kind of beat up on yourself and say, oh, because I've done X, Y, and Z wrong, that's why this thing's happened. Which probably isn't the case.
Yeah. Occasionally it is, but, you know.
There were consequences if you make some poor choices, 100%. Doesn't change, you know, doesn't change the fact you're disappointed and would need support.
Yeah, absolutely.
But often they're just, you know, we spoke about it on the health podcast, didn't we? I think a little bit. You know, stuff just happen. It is, you know, bad stuff happens, it does. And so being disappointed with that, yeah, that's absolutely natural.
I mean, the other bits of Bible that I've got in my notes that we kind of talked about a little bit. I shouldn't refer to the notes, really, should I? It's really bad podcasting. But there's kind of like there's a sort of a bit of an interesting kind of juxtaposition, I guess, because you've got like one of the things we talked about was the Israelites in the wilderness, and that even though there was promise, so, you know, manna from heaven and things like that, there was a lot of disillusionment and difficulty. But if you look at Paul in Acts, when there's a lot of difficulty, he's focused on God's purpose, and he has a very different response to kind of what's going on with some of Israel. He seems to be able to kind of overcome these obstacles in a much better way. And I guess this kind of comes on to possibly one of the other themes that we've kind of got here, which is about, you know, hardship isn't always necessarily about fixing situations, but it's about knowing God walking beside us and what that might look like potentially. Don't know if you guys had anything you wanted to say about that.
I think that story of the Israelites leaving Egypt, it just really strikes me as that would be the major disappointment, that you've just got out of slavery, there's this promised land, and then you're just in the desert for 40 years, and you're just wandering around in circles. And I in all honesty, I kind of get the complaining and moaning.
Yeah.
And this is one of the things that really struck me with it, because they did moan to God, they did complain, or they did moan and complain to Moses at least. And I think it's just that difference between when is it moaning and when is it lamenting. I think it's just such a fine line. I mean, do you guys have any thoughts on where that line lies?
Yeah, not really where the line lies, maybe, but maybe our reaction to it, or certainly mine. It can be hard when someone's, I don't know, sad about something and saying how sad it is. There's kind of two elements to it. Sitting and listening to that, again, you want to fix it. You want to sort it out. You want to see if there's something you might be able to do about it, and there's often not anything you can do about it. And just, as you kind of guys have said already, like just being there for the person and taking the time and acknowledging and saying, yeah, that is rubbish. I hear you. The temptation also can be to try and put the positive spin on it. Oh, don't worry.
Yeah.
You know, you can put the other side of it. Everything happens for a reason. It's going to turn out well. And even some of the things that we said already, like kind of, you know, it's all in the process. You're disappointed, but you'll get to a good point. Yeah, I think, of course. I think that's very good and definitely true. Sometimes you might not want to hear that at that point when you are disappointed or find it difficult to process. But sometimes you do. Sometimes you do need to hear the hope in it as well. So it's kind of striking that balance when there is a real disappointment there, but also is there a way of putting your mind or eyes on something of hope, something of God's hope in the situation. And that can be really tricky to help someone with that, can't it? Or even process it for yourself. Because sometimes it can be easy to think, oh yeah, I'm disappointed, I don't want to wallow in it or whatever, which again is a positive perhaps starts to take, but at the same time it can be really healthy to just be like, yeah, this is rubbish. I'm going to engage with that actually for a bit, and that's fine.
So like, what would you say, for the people listening, what would you say you'd want their key takeaways to be?
I think probably with what we've kind of said here, the key point is being real with God and others rather than trying to kind of put perhaps a veneer that kind of you're coping with it, or that, you know, if you believe God's in control and you're feeling good about where he's taking you, great, absolutely say that. If that's not how you're feeling, don't feel like you need to pretend that's the case. God's big enough to handle your disappointment. We sometimes, with a lot of kicking and screaming, believe that he is good enough to actually show you something more in what's going on through some of these things, rather than it just being about what you're going through right now. But I think, you know, in terms of the kind of big bits, there's the being real with God, but also being real with others as well. I think we talked a lot about kind of the role of other people in this as well. And I think, you know, we want to acknowledge that disappointment can be, you know, exacerbated when you don't have those people to process things with. And if that's you, you know, like, yeah, that's awful. I know we want to acknowledge that. and probably when we pray at the end, we might pray for you specifically if you're hearing that and feeling that way. But also, I think one of the things, and we won't go deep into wisdom literature because we're not a theology podcast, as we keep saying. But I think one of the things that's really interesting with the Book of Ecclesiastes, which some people, think is a really depressing book. I don't find it depressing. I find it really uplifting, partly because people 6,000 years ago, whenever it was written, probably not that, probably more like 3,000-4,000 years ago, were feeling things about the way the world works then that I'm feeling now. And, there's a continuity there and sort of comfort in that feeling. But one of the things that it really does encourage us to do when we see injustice around us, we see bad people being rewarded, good people being, trodden on and kind of experiencing the worst, when we see our work come to nothing or other people's good work come to nothing, actually one of the things it does tell us to do is enjoy the people around us, enjoy, eating and drinking with them, enjoy the good things that you've got while pleasing God and looking to do that. And actually that is, you can control that. You can make a decision to do that. And I think when I come back to sort of some of the stuff that we've kind of got there, there is a kind of thing when I think about some of the stuff with Dad, like part of what that experience did teach me to do at the time was, focus very much on, I need to kind of enjoy what I can this week, today, maybe in the next 5 minutes before, another phone call comes over and I need to come and do something, and I think, I don't know if I always live in the good of that now. I couldn't say it's a permanent change, but I think being real with God and others, and then also being able to just kind of look at what God has given you now and try and make a choice to enjoy that, it can be an important thing to do at points.
I would just add to that. I would say disappointment is guaranteed. Jesus says that things are going to go badly. If you look at Paul, I'm pretty sure when he got stoned and all of that stuff, it was a bit disappointing, to say the least. But yeah, I think that narrative that we have, that you do the right things and good things happen, things fall into place. Yeah, that does happen sometimes, but actually bad things will happen. But we have a God that is close, and we have a God that is very faithful, and he's sovereign. He's able to do all sorts of things.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've also spoken today about coming through disappointment and through grief with a new perspective afterwards, or developing a new perspective through it. And I think that can so often be true, and God wouldn't put this stuff on us to cause these things, but he will use these things as he walks with us through those disappointments and through those challenges, to help maybe that we would see a new perspective as we come out the end of it, or during it, that we wouldn't have had before or wouldn't see before. Because as you said, he's faithful in that. Let's take a bit of time to pray for folk that are listening. If you're experiencing some disappointment at the moment, or have done, and you're still reeling from it, something you're grieving perhaps, could be loads of different reasons why you're disappointed with life generally, or you have had a disappointment and that's in the past. God, I pray that you would allow those listening to get a glimpse of the fact that you are close to them. It's not always obvious. It doesn't always feel like that. And I think we can all relate to that, and there's loads of stories in the Bible of people that have quite explicitly related to that. Lord, I pray that you would just make yourself known fresh to anyone listening who's living with that disappointment now.
Yeah, God, we acknowledge that feeling. You acknowledge that feeling, you hear that feeling. And I think, if that is you, God sees you and knows you in that. He knows you in this moment, who you were before and who you'll be after. And I just pray that those people, whether it's while they're listening to this podcast or after or over a period of a while, we just really pray that you know God's goodness in what is going on, whatever that looks like for you. And yeah, that there's just, you start perhaps in a place where you've been a bit stuck to see something like maybe some green shoots kind of come up. But yeah, we just pray that you find what those things are, and some of the things we've talked about today, particularly for folk that are struggling to think of other people they can share that with. Just pray that you provide those people in their lives.
Yeah.
And for those of you who are experiencing disappointment right now, I would just say, close your eyes, take a minute, and just think about what is it I'm disappointed with, and just tell God, God, this has happened and it hurts. I don't understand why. You don't need to ask him for anything. Just tell him how you're feeling. I think that draws us to an end there.
Yes.
I think so.
Disappointment is always a cheery topic, isn't it? It'd be great to hear your thoughts. So if you want to drop us a comment, that would be great. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.
Yeah. See you guys soon.
Thanks for listening. As ever, we'd love to hear your thoughts on the chat today. Please get in touch with us on our site at www.richardandmike.com. That's with an AND in the middle. By email at info@richardandmike.com, and on Instagram with @richardandmike. Thanks again. See you next time.